fear makes liars of our perceptions. I learned this truth at 24,000 feet on Mount Everest in May of 1985, when I ran from what I believed was certain death and discovered something that would haunt and humble me for the rest of my life. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I am the man who attacked a Yeti, not the other way around. I was 31 years old that spring, an Australian climber with more ambition than wisdom, attempting Everest as part of a commercial expedition led by an American company that promised summits to anyone with sufficient funds and passable fitness. It was my third attempt at an 8,000er, my previous efforts on Cho Oyu and Manaslu having ended in failure due to weather and my own inadequate preparation. Everest was supposed to be redemption, proof that I belonged among serious mountaineers despite my relatively limited experience. Our expedition consisted of 12 clients and 4 guides, plus a support team of Sherpa climbers who did the real work of establishing camps and fixing ropes, while we paid customers followed predetermined routes like tourists on an extreme hiking trail. I chafed at this arrangement, wanting to prove myself through independent achievement rather than guided ascent, but I lacked the resources and connections to attempt Everest solo. The climb proceeded smoothly through April, our team acclimatizing well and establishing camps up to the South Col at 26,000 feet. The weather window opened in early May, and we made our summit push on May 8th. Leaving the South Col at 11 p.m. for the long night climb to the top of the world. I was paired with a guide named Rick Morrison, a Colorado native with 15 years of Himalayan experience who treated clients with barely concealed contempt. He made clear from the start that he considered most of us incompetent amateurs buying achievements we hadn't earned, and his assessment wasn't entirely wrong.
But his attitude grated, made me determined to prove I was different from the other paying clients, that I had genuine mountaineering ability rather than just a checkbook. We reached the balcony at 27,000 feet around 3 a.m., the halfway point where many climbers turned back due to exhaustion or altitude effects. I was struggling, the thin air making every step an exercise in willpower, my supplemental oxygen barely adequate to the demands I was placing on my body. But I refused to quit. Refused to give Rick the satisfaction of seeing me fail. "You're moving too slow," Rick said as we rested briefly at the balcony. "At this pace, we won't summit before the turnaround time. You need to decide now. Push harder or descend safely." Pride made my decision. I can go faster. I just needed a minute to catch my breath. Rick's expression suggested he doubted this, but he nodded. "Your call. But if you can't maintain pace, I'm turning us around regardless of how close we get. I'm not dying up here because you're too stubborn to admit your limits." We continued upward through darkness that seemed absolute despite our headlamps, following fixed ropes through terrain that would have been technically challenging at sea level but became nightmarish in the death zone. My legs trembled with exhaustion, my lungs burned despite supplemental oxygen, and my mind began playing tricks, seeing movement in shadows, hearing voices in the wind, experiencing the mild hallucinations that accompany severe altitude exposure. Around 5 a.m., as dawn began painting the eastern sky, I saw something that I initially dismissed as another altitude-induced illusion. A figure, perhaps 50 yards off our route, moving across the slope with a gait that seemed wrong for the terrain. Too fluid, too confident, lacking the labored struggle that characterized human movement at this altitude. I stopped, staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was large, covered in dark fur that stood out against the snow, moving on 2 legs, but with proportions that weren't quite human. My oxygen-deprived brain struggled to categorize it, cycling through possibilities. Another climber in unusual clothing, a large animal that somehow existed at this impossible altitude, or hallucination more vivid than the shadows I'd been seeing all night. "Rick," I called out, my voice muffled by my oxygen mask. "Do you see that?" Rick turned, following my pointing finger, and I saw his body language shift from casual alertness to sudden tension. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "Is that what I think it is?" The figure turned toward us, as if aware of our attention, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. Not human, not ape exactly. something between, with features that created cognitive dissonance, too intelligent for animal, too alien for human. And it was looking directly at us with eyes that reflected our headlamps with an amber glow. Then it started moving in our direction. Daniel is about to make a decision that will change everything. What happens when fear meets the unknown at the top of the world? Make sure to like this video and subscribe for the shocking truth of what really happened. Rational thought disappeared, replaced by pure survival instinct. The creature was approaching, moving faster than should have been possible at this altitude, covering ground with efficiency that made our labored climbing seem pathetic by comparison. My mind screamed a single word: predator. Run, I said, my voice rising to panic. Rick, we need to run. Don't, Rick started, but I was already moving, abandoning the fixed rope, scrambling across the slope away from the approaching figure. My exhaustion vanished, replaced by adrenaline that overrode altitude and oxygen deprivation, giving me energy I hadn't possessed moments before. I heard Rick shouting behind me, his words lost in wind and my own panicked breathing. I didn't stop, didn't look back, focused entirely on putting distance between myself and the thing that was surely pursuing me. I'd heard stories about Yeti attacks, climbers found dead with injuries that couldn't be explained, expeditions that vanished without trace. I wasn't going to become another cautionary tale. The slope I'd chosen was steep, unstable, the kind of terrain we'd been specifically told to avoid. But fear overwhelmed caution. I was moving too fast, my crampons catching on ice, my balance compromised by panic and altitude. I felt myself falling, tried to self-arrest with my ice axe, but my technique was sloppy, my reactions dulled by oxygen deprivation. I tumbled perhaps 30 feet down the slope, my body ragdolling over ice and rock, before slamming into a small ledge that arrested my fall. The impact drove the air from my lungs, sent pain shooting through my ribs and left shoulder, left me gasping and disoriented, my oxygen mask torn partially away from my face. I lay there trying to breathe, trying to process what had happened, trying to determine if I'd broken bones or damaged equipment that would make survival impossible. Above me, I could hear voices, Rick shouting, and other sounds I couldn't identify, movement approaching down the slope I'd just fallen. The creature appeared at the edge of the ledge, silhouetted against the lightning sky. I tried to scramble backward, away from what I still perceived as threat, but my injured body wouldn't cooperate. I was trapped, helpless, about to be killed by something that shouldn't exist. But the attack didn't come. Instead, the creature knelt at the edge of the ledge, making sounds that weren't growls or roars, but something more complex, almost like speech in a language I couldn't understand. It reached down with one massive hand, not grabbing or striking, but offering, palm up, in a gesture that was unmistakably an offer of help. I stared at that hand, easily twice the size of my own, covered in thick dark fur, with fingers that ended in nails rather than claws. Not the hand of a predator, the hand of something intelligent, something capable of compassion, something offering assistance to the idiot who had panicked and nearly killed himself running from imagined threat. Shame flooded through me, hot and overwhelming despite the freezing temperature. I had run. I had assumed attack without any evidence beyond the creature's existence and approach. I had let fear override reason, had nearly died because I couldn't see past my own terror long enough to recognize an encounter rather than an assault. I'm sorry, I said, my voice rough and broken. I thought. I didn't know. The creature tilted its head, the gesture suggesting it understood tone if not words. It made that complex sound again, and somehow I felt meaning in it. Not anger at my reaction, but something closer to disappointment or sadness that I had been so afraid, that I had run instead of standing still and allowing peaceful contact. Rick appeared beside the creature, his face showing mixture of awe and frustration. "You complete idiot," he said, though his voice lacked heat. "It was trying to help us. There's unstable ice ahead, avalanche danger we couldn't see in the dark. It came to warn us, to redirect us to safer route. And you panicked and nearly killed yourself running from the one thing up here that was trying to keep us alive." Rick and the creature worked together to extract me from the ledge, their cooperation suggesting this wasn't Rick's first encounter with beings that shouldn't exist. The creature did most of the work, its strength making my weight trivial despite the altitude and difficult positioning. It lifted me as easily as I might lift a child, moving with careful precision to avoid aggravating my injuries. Once I was back on more stable ground, Rick examined me with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd dealt with climbing injuries before. Cracked ribs probably, definitely bruised. Left shoulder might be separated. You're lucky you didn't break your neck or rupture something internal. And your oxygen system is damaged. You've been breathing ambient air for at least 5 minutes, which at this altitude could kill you even if your injuries don't. The creature was watching this examination, its attention focused, and its posture suggesting concern rather than threat. Up close, in growing daylight, I could see it clearly. Perhaps 8.5 feet tall, covered in fur that ranged from black to dark brown, with a face that combined ape and human characteristics in proportions that created something entirely unique. The eyes were the most striking feature, large, amber-colored, holding intelligence that was unmistakable and unsettling in how human it seemed despite the alien features surrounding it. Rick pulled emergency oxygen from his pack, rigging a temporary system to replace my damaged equipment. As he worked, he spoke to the creature in a combination of gestures and sounds that suggested established communication protocol. "How long have you known about them?" I asked, my voice weak from pain and oxygen deprivation. 6 years, Rick replied. "Since my 3rd Everest expedition, when I got separated from my team during a storm and would have died if one of them hadn't guided me to shelter and kept me alive for 18 hours until rescue could reach me. They're not aggressive. They don't attack climbers. They're guardians, protecting these mountains and occasionally protecting stupid humans from their own poor decisions." The creature made a sound that might have been agreement or amusement. It reached into what appeared to be a natural pouch formed by thick fur on its torso and produced something that made me question everything I thought I understood about these beings. A carved wooden bowl, simple but clearly crafted with tool use and aesthetic consideration. The creature filled the bowl from a water source I hadn't noticed, a trickle of melt water running through rocks, and offered it to me. I accepted with shaking hands, drinking water that tasted pure and cold, and somehow restorative beyond simple hydration. The creature watched me drink, then gently touched my injured shoulder with one massive finger, its expression suggesting it was evaluating damage with knowledge that went beyond instinct. CTA, what Daniel thought was an attack was actually an attempt to save his life. The truth is far more incredible than he imagined. If you're shocked by this revelation, hit that like button and subscribe to see what happens next. They have medical knowledge, Rick explained, seeing my surprise. Not like ours, but effective. I've seen them treat injuries, set broken bones, apply what looks like herbal remedies that actually work. They understand the human body better than you'd expect from beings that supposedly don't exist. The creature made a series of sounds and gestures, its communication directed at Rick, who nodded slowly. "It says the summit is impossible for you today. Your injuries, combined with damaged oxygen system and the time we've lost, mean continuing upward would likely kill you. It's offering to guide us to a place where we can safely wait for rescue, a sheltered location where you won't die of exposure while we radio for help." "I don't want to give up the summit," I said, the words automatic despite knowing they were foolish. Even as I spoke them, I recognized the absurdity. I was injured, under-oxygenated, and being offered survival by something I tried to run from. But ego dies hard, especially ego built on multiple failures. Rick's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice. Your summit attempt is over. The only question is whether you accept help gracefully or whether I have to make that decision for you and deal with your resentment all the way down." The creature touched my uninjured shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle, and I felt something pass between us that wasn't quite communication but was more than simple physical contact. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition that my fear and flight had come from ignorance rather than malice, that I was being offered chance to learn rather than being punished for my panic. I nodded slowly, accepting what had to be accepted. "Thank you," I said, looking directly at the creature, "for trying to help, for saving me from my own stupidity, for not being what I assumed you were." The creature inclined its head slightly, acknowledgement or acceptance of apology, I couldn't tell which. Then it gestured for us to follow, beginning to move across the slope with that same fluid confidence I'd observed before, choosing a route that avoided hazards I couldn't see but that clearly existed for those with eyes to recognize them. The journey to the shelter took 3 hours, moving slowly to accommodate my injuries and damaged oxygen supply. The creature led us to an area I would never have found on my own, a crevasse system that had been partially filled with ice and snow, creating a network of protected spaces invisible from normal approach routes. One particular cavity had been deliberately modified, rocks arranged to provide wind protection, dried grasses somehow transported to high altitude to create insulation, even what looked like stored supplies wrapped in material I couldn't immediately identify. They maintain emergency shelters, Rick explained as the creature settled me into the most protected space. Across multiple mountains, at various altitudes, they're not always inhabited, but they're always prepared. I've used 2 others on different expeditions when weather or circumstances made reaching camps impossible. They've probably saved a dozen lives that I know about, and who knows how many more that never got reported because climbers didn't want to admit they'd seen something impossible. The creature disappeared briefly, returning with materials that included actual fuel, dried vegetation that shouldn't have existed at this altitude but clearly did, stored against need. It kindled a fire with practiced ease, creating warmth that felt miraculous in the death zone where such comfort should have been impossible. Rick used our radio to contact base camp, reporting our situation without mentioning the creature's involvement. He described my injuries and our location in coordinates that would allow rescue team to reach us, estimating 12 to 18 hours before extraction would be possible, depending on weather and availability of personnel. "You're going to have time to think about what happened," Rick said after completing the radio call. "About your reaction, your assumptions, the gap between what you feared and what was actually occurring. I suggest you use that time productively, because this could be a defining moment. Either you learn from it and become better climber and better person, or you rationalize and justify and remain the same reckless amateur who nearly died from his own panic." The creature was tending the fire, its movements economical and purposeful. Watching it work, I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I'd been taught about evolution, biology, and what was supposed to be possible. This being crafted tools, maintained shelters, understood human physiology, and communicated through complex systems that suggested language and culture. It was intelligent in ways that demanded recognition as person rather than animal, yet science insisted such things couldn't exist. "Why don't more people know about them?" I asked. "If they're real, if they help climbers, why isn't this common knowledge?" "Because revelation would destroy them," Rick replied. "Can you imagine what would happen if their existence was confirmed? Scientists would want to study them, capture them for research. Trophy hunters would want to kill them for prestige. Governments would want to classify them, control them, determine whether they're threat or resource. And all the idiots who come to these mountains seeking adventure would push deeper into the areas where these beings have found refuge, destroying the last sanctuaries they have." The creature looked at me when Rick said this, and I felt evaluation in its gaze. It was deciding whether I could be trusted, whether showing me its existence and its shelter would lead to protection or exploitation. I understood suddenly that my reaction over the next hours and days would matter, that I was being given a choice similar to the one it had offered when I'd lain injured on that ledge: accept help and learn, or cling to fear and ignorance. "I won't tell anyone," I said, directing my words to the creature rather than Rick. "I understand why secrecy matters, and I understand I owe you my life. That creates obligations I intend to honor." The creature made a sound that might have been acceptance, though I couldn't be certain. It produced something from the shelter's stored supplies, a salve or ointment with a smell I couldn't identify, and gestured at my injured shoulder. Rick nodded approval, and I removed enough layers to expose the damaged area. The creature's application of the salve was surprisingly gentle, its massive hands capable of delicate precision. The ointment felt cool initially, then began to warm, penetrating deep into injured tissue in ways that brought both pain and relief. Within minutes, the swelling was visibly reduced. The range of motion improved enough that I could move my arm without the sharp stabbing sensation that had characterized every motion since my fall. "What is that?" I asked, amazed at the rapid effectiveness. "No idea," Rick admitted. "They've used it on me before, and it works better than anything in our medical kits. But they won't share the ingredients, and attempts to analyze samples have been inconclusive. Just added to the list of things about them we don't understand, but benefit from anyway." The hours waiting for rescue were strange and transformative. The creature remained with us, tending the fire, occasionally offering water or what appeared to be dried food that looked unappetizing but tasted surprisingly good. It didn't speak, at least not in any language I could recognize, but it communicated through gesture, expression, and sometimes through that strange sense of meaning that seemed to transfer directly without verbal mediation. Rick talked, filling the time with stories of other encounters, other climbers who had been helped or warned or saved by beings that supposedly didn't exist. He painted a picture of an entire hidden society spread across the Himalayan range, maintaining territories and helping humans who approached their spaces with respect while discouraging or redirecting those who came with arrogance or destructive intent. They're not perfect, Rick said. They're not magical or supernatural. They're intelligent beings adapted to an environment humans can barely survive, and they have their own needs and problems. Climate change is destroying their habitat, reducing the refuges where they can exist without human interference. Tourist climbing has made isolation nearly impossible. They're under pressure from every direction, and they've made a choice to occasionally reveal themselves to individuals they think can help protect what's left of their territory. Why me? I asked. I ran from it. I nearly killed myself in panic. Why show me all this after I demonstrated I'm exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be trusted? Daniel is confronting the truth about himself and the being he feared. The transformation has only just begun. Make sure you're subscribed and hit like to witness what happens when ignorance meets enlightenment at the top of the world. Because you survived the encounter. The creature responded, not in words, but in understanding that somehow entered my consciousness directly. It wanted me to know that most humans who panicked and ran didn't survive the experience, dying from falls or exposure or getting lost in terrain that offered no forgiveness. My survival, despite my fear and poor decisions, suggested something worth saving, potential worth developing. And more than that, it wanted me to carry shame and humility forward, to remember my panic and use that memory to become better. The being I'd feared wasn't looking for perfect humans to trust. It was looking for flawed ones capable of growth, people who could learn from mistakes and transform fear into understanding. The rescue team arrived in late afternoon, guided by Rick's coordinates, to our sheltered location. By then, the creature had withdrawn, disappearing into the crevasse system before the rescuers came into view. Its absence felt like loss, like I was being separated from teacher before lessons were complete. But something remained, a carved piece of stone, no larger than a coin, that the creature had pressed into my hand before leaving. It was smooth from handling, marked with symbols I couldn't read, but that clearly conveyed meaning. A gift or a reminder or both. Something to carry forward as proof that the encounter had been real and that the obligations it created were genuine. The descent to base camp took 2 days, my injuries making rapid movement impossible. The expedition doctor examined me, confirming cracked ribs and shoulder separation, prescribing rest and pain management and immediate descent to lower altitude. My Everest attempt was officially over, ended not by weather or inadequate acclimatization, but by my own panicked flight from imagined danger. I should have been devastated. I'd paid significant money for this expedition, had trained for months, had invested ego and ambition in reaching the summit. But all I felt was gratitude, for survival, for encounter, for the chance to learn something more important than whether I could stand on top of a particular mountain. Rick found me at base camp the evening before my departure for Kathmandu. "You handled it better than most," he said, his grudging respect evident. "The ones who panic usually rationalize, convince themselves they were right to be afraid, maintain their fear rather than examining it. You're actually thinking about what happened, about your reaction, about what it means. That's rare. What do I do now?" I asked. "I know things I'm not supposed to know. I've been shown things that could change how people understand these mountains and the beings that live here. But I also understand why revelation would be disaster. How do I carry that forward?" Rick pulled out a worn notebook, writing an address and phone number. There are others like us, climbers who have encountered them, who understand the need for protection. We're not organized exactly, but we stay in contact, share information, try to make choices that serve their needs rather than human curiosity. Contact this number when you get back to Australia. Tell them what happened. They'll help you understand your role in this. He paused, looking at the mountains rising around us. And consider whether you still want to be climbing these peaks. Now that you know they're inhabited, now that you understand your presence here affects beings with their own right to exist unmolested, continuing to climb might feel different. Some of us keep coming back, trying to act as buffers between the climbing community and the guardians. Others realize the most respectful thing they can do is stay away. Let these spaces remain as wild and unvisited as possible. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew my relationship with mountains had changed fundamentally. That the person who had started up Everest seeking personal glory was not the same person descending with injuries and knowledge that demanded humility rather than achievement.
I returned to Australia in June 1985, my ribs healing slowly and my mind processing experiences that had no framework for easy integration. Friends and family wanted to hear about Everest, about the summit attempt, about what it felt like to climb in the death zone. I told sanitized versions, the injuries from a fall, the rescue, the disappointment of not reaching the top. I never mentioned what I'd run from or what had saved me. The nightmares started within weeks of my return. Not of the creature, I never dreamed of it as threat. Instead, I dreamed of falling, of that moment when panic overrode judgment and sent me tumbling down unstable slope. I would wake gasping, feeling the impact against the ledge, remembering the shame that had flooded through me when I'd looked up to see an offered hand instead of attacking claws. I contacted the number Rick had given me in August, when my ribs had healed enough that I could breathe without pain and my shoulder had regained most of its range of motion. The man who answered identified himself only as Peter and suggested we meet in Sydney the following week. Peter turned out to be in his 50s, a New Zealand mountaineer who had been climbing Himalayan peaks since the 1960s. We met at a cafe in Bondi Beach, far from mountains and tourists who might overhear sensitive conversations. Rick told me what happened, Peter said after we'd ordered coffee. That you panicked, ran, injured yourself, and were saved by the being you'd fled from. He said you seemed genuinely affected by the experience, that you might be someone who could learn rather than simply rationalize. I'm trying to learn, I replied. But I don't know what the lesson is beyond don't panic when encountering things you don't understand, which seems obvious in retrospect. Peter smiled slightly. The lesson is deeper than that. You assumed threat without evidence. You let fear override observation. And you made decisions based on stories and assumptions rather than what was actually happening in front of you. Those tendencies exist in all of us, the difference is whether we recognize them and work to overcome them, or whether we let them continue to control our responses to the unknown. He pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents that detailed encounters similar to mine spanning 3 decades. Climbers who had met the beings, been helped or warned by them, and chosen either to protect their existence through silence or to exploit the encounters through revelation. The pattern was clear: those who protected were invited into a loose network of guardians, while those who exploited found themselves isolated, their credibility questioned, their future encounters with the beings non-existent. We're not an organization, Peter explained. We're just individuals who understand we've been trusted with knowledge that creates responsibility. Some of us continue climbing, acting as buffers between the beings and less informed climbers. Others advocate for conservation and restricted access to sensitive areas. A few focus on documenting encounters and behaviors, building a private archive that might someday be useful if circumstances change and revelation becomes necessary or inevitable. What do you want me to do? I asked. Whatever you feel called to do. But understand that you are now part of a story larger than your individual experience. The beings chose to help you despite your panic, chose to reveal their shelter and their capabilities, chose to trust you with knowledge that could harm them. That creates obligation, but what form that obligation takes is up to you to determine. Over the following months, I struggled with that obligation. I had returned to work as a civil engineer, building bridges and roads that connected human spaces with increasing efficiency. But my mind remained in the mountains, processing what I'd experienced, questioning what my role should be in protecting beings whose existence I could never prove but whose reality I could never doubt. In 1987, I received a letter forwarded through the Guardian network from someone who signed only as a M. The writer described encountering multiple beings in the Annapurna region, observing behavior that suggested sophisticated social structure and cultural practices. M was planning a return expedition focused on careful documentation without intrusion, and was seeking others who might be interested in participating. I flew to Nepal in October 1987, meeting M, who turned out to be Dr. Margaret Chen, a Singaporean anthropologist who had been studying indigenous knowledge systems in the Himalayas when she'd accidentally encountered the beings. Her expedition consisted of 4 people: herself, a Sherpa guide named Lakpa who had grown up with stories of the beings, a wildlife photographer named Andre who specialized in capturing images without disturbing subjects, and myself, included because my engineering background made me useful for establishing observation posts and because my 1985 experience gave me credibility within the Guardian network. We spent 6 weeks in the Annapurna Conservation Area, moving carefully through terrain that showed signs of the being's presence, unusual tracks, modified vegetation suggesting deliberate cultivation, and areas where snow accumulation patterns suggested regular passage by large bipedal creatures. We established observation positions in locations that provided views without requiring intrusion into what appeared to be primary habitat. The beings tolerated our presence, or perhaps simply chose not to drive us away. We observed them from distances of 200 to 400 yards, documenting behaviors that suggested complexity far beyond what skeptics claimed was possible for undiscovered species. We saw tool manufacture, the crafting of implements from stone and bone with techniques that implied generational knowledge transfer. We witnessed social interaction that included what appeared to be teaching young ones, care for injured individuals, and coordinated activities that required planning and communication. Daniel has joined an expedition that's documenting the undocumented, proving the impossible without being able to share the proof. If this journey is captivating you, make sure to like and subscribe to see what they discover. Andre captured photographs that were extraordinary in their clarity and detail, images that would have revolutionized anthropology and biology if we could have released them. But the purpose of documentation wasn't revelation, it was preservation of knowledge for the Guardian network, evidence that could be used internally to make informed decisions about protection strategies and conservation priorities. On our final week in the region, I had my second direct encounter. I was alone at an observation post early one morning when one of the beings approached, not the same individual from Everest in 1985, but a member of the same species, similar in size and proportions but with slightly different coloring and scarring patterns. It sat perhaps 30 yards from my position, clearly aware of my presence and choosing proximity rather than distance. We regarded each other in silence for several minutes, and I felt evaluation happening, judgment being made about my purpose and my trustworthiness. Then it gestured, a deliberate beckoning motion that was unmistakable in its meaning. It was inviting me closer, offering the chance for interaction rather than simple observation. I approached slowly, hands visible and empty, moving with the kind of care you'd use approaching wild animal you respected. But this wasn't a wild animal, and treating it as such felt like insult. This was a person, intelligent and aware, and I tried to convey through my movement and posture that I recognized its personhood. The being allowed me to approach within 10 feet before gesturing for me to stop. Then it reached into the natural pouch in its fur and produced something that made my breath catch, the carved stone it had given me in 1985, or one identical to it. The being held it up, clearly indicating it recognized me, knew I carried the gift it had provided, understood I had honored the trust placed in me. It made sounds, complex vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning even though I couldn't understand the language. And somehow, through mechanisms I still don't comprehend, meaning transferred, not complete sentences or detailed information, but emotional content and general concepts. Gratitude for protection. Recognition that humans like myself were working to preserve their territories and their privacy. Concern about increasing pressure from commercial climbing and tourism. And most significantly, awareness that their time in physical form was limited, that environmental changes and human expansion were making their traditional existence unsustainable. The being stood, preparing to leave, but before it departed it placed something in my hands, a small carved figure, no more than 3 inches tall, depicting one of their species in remarkable detail. It was art, craft, culture made tangible, proof of sophistication that went beyond tool use into aesthetic expression. Then it was gone, moving back into the forest with speed that made tracking impossible, leaving me holding evidence I couldn't share and knowledge that weighed heavier with each passing year. Margaret's expedition published a carefully worded paper in an obscure anthropology journal in 1989, describing anomalous primate behaviors observed in remote Himalayan regions without claiming discovery of new species or providing details that would allow others to replicate our observations. The paper was largely ignored by mainstream science but circulated within the Guardian network as confirmation that the being's sophistication extended beyond what even we had previously documented. I returned to Australia and tried to resume normal life, but the 2 encounters had changed me in ways that made conventional existence feel hollow. I had witnessed intelligence that science denied existed, had been trusted with knowledge that couldn't be shared, had seen beauty and complexity in beings whose very existence remained controversial. In 1992, I quit my engineering job and moved to Nepal permanently, taking work as a trekking guide for the growing tourist industry while privately using my position to monitor climbing routes and discourage intrusions into sensitive areas. I became known as the guide who refused certain clients, who turned away expeditions that wanted to push into remote regions, who advocated for conservation with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to practical concerns. The Guardian network provided support and connection, a community of people who understood what I was protecting and why. We numbered perhaps 40 by the mid-1990s, scattered across a dozen countries but united by encounters that had transformed our relationship with mountains and with the idea that humans were the only intelligent species worth protecting. But transformation came at cost. Relationships suffered because I couldn't fully explain my motivations. Career opportunities were lost because I prioritized guardianship over advancement. And isolation deepened because carrying knowledge others couldn't accept created fundamental loneliness that connection with fellow guardians only partially addressed. In 1998, I received news that Rick Morrison had died on K2, caught in an avalanche during a rescue attempt that saved 2 clients but cost him his life. At his memorial service in Colorado, I met others he had guided or helped, and discovered that at least 4 had encountered the beings during expeditions Rick had led. He had been doing what I was attempting, using his position to facilitate understanding while maintaining necessary secrecy, creating opportunities for those he judged ready while protecting those who weren't from encounters that might prove harmful to beings or humans. His death reinforced my understanding that guardianship was generational work, that no individual could protect the beings indefinitely but that networks could persist across decades if we recruited and trained successors carefully. #**** Chapter 9 ****. The early 2000s brought accelerating challenges. Commercial climbing exploded, with multiple companies offering guided ascents of Everest and other 8,000ers. Areas that had seen 50 climbers per season in the 1980s were now receiving 500. The being's traditional territories were being traversed by people who had no idea they were intruding, who treated mountains as playgrounds without understanding they were inhabited. The Guardian network adapted, with younger members using internet technology to coordinate more effectively while maintaining security that prevented exposure. We developed strategies for subtle discouragement, planting concerns about avalanche danger in certain areas, suggesting alternative routes that avoided sensitive territories, occasionally allowing equipment failures that forced expeditions to turn back before reaching locations where encounters seemed likely. But we were fighting demographic and economic forces beyond our control. Nepal's economy depended increasingly on tourism, with mountaineering generating significant revenue. The government had little incentive to restrict access, and the climbing community largely dismissed concerns about environmental impact or hypothetical wildlife that couldn't be proven to exist. I had my third significant encounter in 2005, on a solo trek through a region north of Manaslu that had been identified as probable territory. I was 51 years old, my body worn by 2 decades of high-altitude living, but my commitment to guardianship undiminished. The being that approached me was elderly. I could see it in movement patterns, in the grey tones infiltrating its fur, in the way it moved with careful deliberation rather than the fluid grace I'd observed in younger individuals. It settled near my camp, watching me with eyes that held something like resignation or acceptance. Communication came more easily than in previous encounters, as if either I had developed capacity for receiving or it had refined its ability to project meaning. What I understood was sobering. The being's population had declined to perhaps 30 individuals across the entire Himalayan range. They were functionally extinct, unable to maintain genetic diversity necessary for long-term survival even if habitat pressures somehow lessened. But they weren't simply dying. They were adapting, transitioning, learning to exist in forms less vulnerable to human expansion and environmental change. The elderly being was showing me this, demonstrating how consciousness could merge with landscape, how awareness could persist beyond individual physical bodies. The beings Daniel has protected for 20 years are vanishing, but not in the way anyone expected. What happens when species transcends extinction through transformation? Stay with us, like and subscribe to witness the conclusion. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking, the recognition that the beings I devoted 2 decades to protecting were transitioning into forms that no longer needed my protection, but that meant the end of physical existence as I'd known it. The carved stone I still carried, the small figure I'd been given in 1987, these would become artifacts of extinct species, proof that consciousness more sophisticated than most humans acknowledged had existed in these mountains. The being touched my chest where it had touched me in 1985, over my heart, and I felt transfer of something I can't adequately describe. Not information exactly, but connection, a link to consciousness that would persist even after physical form dispersed. I would carry part of them forward, merge somehow with my own awareness, ensuring that when last physical being transformed, their perspective and wisdom wouldn't entirely vanish. When it withdrew its hand, I was crying, grief for loss, gratitude for trust, acceptance of transformation that made extinction less absolute even as it confirmed the end of one form of existence. I am 67 years old now, writing this in 2021 from my home in the Kathmandu Valley. 36 years have passed since that May morning on Everest when I panicked and ran from what I thought was attack but was actually attempt to save my life. That moment of fear and the shame that followed it defined everything that came after, my choices, my career, my purpose. The beings are gone in physical form. The last confirmed sighting was in 2012, and even that was ambiguous, possibly more imagination than observation. The Guardian network continues, but we're transitioning from protection of living beings to preservation of memory and knowledge. We document, we archive, we ensure that when we're gone, future generations will have evidence that consciousness more varied than we acknowledged once existed alongside us. I think often about that moment on the ledge, looking up at offered hand and understanding how thoroughly I'd misjudged the situation. I ran from help. I fled from compassion. I nearly died because I assumed threat rather than observing reality. That moment taught me humility that 2 decades of climbing never had, the recognition that fear makes us stupid, that assumptions can be deadly, that the unknown deserves investigation rather than panic. The beings could have let me die. They could have withdrawn, left me to freeze or succumb to my injuries, allowed natural consequences to punish my fear and poor judgment. But they chose mercy instead, chose to help despite my panic, chose to reveal themselves and their shelters and their capabilities to someone who had demonstrated he wasn't worthy of that trust. And in doing so, they transformed me from climber seeking personal glory into guardian trying to protect something more important than individual achievement. The summit of Everest, which had seemed crucial in 1985, became trivial compared to the responsibility of carrying knowledge forward, of honoring beings who had trusted me with their existence. I never did reach that summit. Never stood on top of the world or achieved the mountaineering accomplishments I'd once dreamed of. But I received something more valuable, understanding that consciousness exists in forms we barely recognize, that intelligence operates at scales we struggle to perceive, that the boundaries between species and between physical and non-physical are more permeable than conventional science acknowledges. The carved stone I was given in 1985 sits on my desk, worn smooth by 36 years of handling. The small figure from 1987 rests beside it. They're artifacts now, proof of species that transformed rather than simply going extinct, evidence that will outlast me and perhaps help future generations understand what existed in these mountains before human expansion made physical form unsustainable. The Guardian network has expanded to include over 100 people across 6 continents, connected by encounters or knowledge or simply commitment to protecting what remains of the territories where beings once lived in physical form. We advocate for conservation, for restricted access to sensitive areas, for recognition that mountains harbor mysteries deserving respect rather than exploitation. But we're also preparing for transition, recognizing that the kind of guardianship that made sense when protecting living beings must evolve into different form now that what we're protecting is memory and possibility. Perhaps consciousness that learned to transcend physical form still exists in these mountains, merged with wind and weather and geological patterns. Perhaps what we witnessed was not extinction but evolution beyond forms we easily perceive. I don't know. I can't prove it. I can only carry forward what I was shown, honor the trust placed in me, and ensure that when the last guardian dies, the knowledge doesn't die with them. That moment on Everest in 1985, when I ran in terror from offered help, was the most important moment of my life. Not because it was heroic or admirable, but because it showed me who I was at my worst and gave me opportunity to become better. The beings could have let fear and shame destroy me. Instead, they offered grace, showed me their world, trusted me with knowledge that transformed panic into purpose. I attacked a Yeti, though I didn't know that's what I was doing. I ran from salvation, fled from compassion, nearly died from fear rather than threat. What happened next shocked me, not violence or abandonment, but mercy and transformation. Not punishment but invitation to become guardian rather than remaining afraid. Daniel Reeves ran from what he thought was a Yeti attack in 1985. What he discovered was consciousness more sophisticated than he'd imagined, compassion more profound than he deserved, and purpose more meaningful than any summit. His panic on Everest transformed into 36 years of guardianship, his fear into humility, his ambition into service. The beings are gone in physical form, but their legacy persists in those who were trusted with knowledge, who chose protection over exploitation, who learned that the unknown deserves investigation rather than panic. Thank you for witnessing this testimony. Share it if you believe transformation is possible, both for individuals and for species. Remember it if you understand that our first reactions to the unknown reveal our limitations, and our capacity to grow beyond those reactions defines our character. Honor it if you recognize that the most important lessons come not from success but from failures that teach us humility and give us opportunity to become better than we were. The mountains remember. The guardians remember. And somewhere, in patterns of wind and weather around peaks that once sheltered beings now transformed, consciousness persists, watching still, evaluating still, waiting to see if humanity can evolve into species worthy of sharing this world with awareness that transcends the forms we easily recognize. What happened next shocked him. But what he did with that shock, the choice to learn rather than rationalize, to transform rather than remain afraid, to serve rather than exploit, that defined a life well lived in service of beings who saved him when he least deserved saving and trusted him when he had given them every reason not to.